In this video, I'm going to be talking about literature reviews. This is an assignment my English 102 students are currently working on, and I want to kind of explain it for their benefit, but also for your benefit. I've done a video on this in the past, but it's been a couple years, so it's probably time I talk about it again. They've also been asking me a few questions about how to complete the assignment, and I thought it might be beneficial to kind of go through and explain this for everybody. So here we go. On the screen in front of me, I've got a Google Doc created and formatted to MLA standards, but there's no content yet. It just has the heading, information, and the title, Literature Review. As we get started, I want to explain, and I've talked about this a couple times recently in a few videos, what a literature review is, how you might hear this used a couple different ways, and what I'm talking about specifically for this episode. Okay, so a literature review, it's going to either be an entire document, if you will, or a section of a research paper. Both are going to be doing the same job. A literature review is going to be a collection of a lot of research on a specific subject. And the purpose for this kind of document is to read all of it and kind of see how this content published by different research, different authors, maybe even different places, how it paints a picture for what the world knows on this given subject, right? So let's say I'm doing one on online learning, for example. I want to make sure that it's specific to a certain area within online learning, and then I'm going to figure out how I'm going to determine which sources I'm going to use or not. This could be its own complete study, or this could be a section in a paper about online learning. And that's going to help me narrow it down. If it's a paper, I'm going to get things that are relevant to my specific topic. Either way, you need to pick and choose what you're going to do. All right, what sort of criteria am I going to use? Am I going to look for things that are within the past 10 years? Am I going to look for content that's within the past 5 years? Because technology is changing really, really fast. Am I going to just try to keep that the majority of my sources are within the past several years, but I might dip back into the past to get other resources that might be kind of seminal texts that are kind of important to the field, right? Whatever criteria you figure out, that's something you can kind of explain at the beginning, and then you just go section by section explaining what the research says. So I don't have a bunch prepared here, but I'm going to kind of show you what this might look like. Okay, so let's say I've got 5 sources. I'm going to refer to them as source A, source B, source C, source D, and source E, right? Okay, now if I'm writing a paper about it, I could use all of these incredibly fast. But what I want to do is not just summarize them individually, because that's not the purpose of a literature review. If I say write a paragraph on source A, and then source B, and then source C, and then source D, and source E, and I call that a paper, I'm missing the point. Dot, dot, dot. Okay. I'm just copying and pasting to make this a little more visual for those who are watching it. I'm kind of creating mock paragraphs. Okay, so let's say I've got 5 different paragraphs. This is not really a review of the literature yet, because it fails the key point of a literature review, which is to look at all the sources and how they relate to each other. So the word I've been using with my students is synthesis. How do these create something new by being combined together? Now, let's say Let's say source A is pro-technology and source B is anti-technology. How might those two synthesize together? Well, one provides context for one perspective. One provides context for a different perspective. They may not agree, but if I'm going to talk about them in, say, another paragraph, let's say I introduce source A, which is for technology, and then I follow that up with source B, which is against technology. My following paragraph might be a paragraph that talks about how these two sources disagree. Does that make sense? That would be a way to create synthesis. I'm showing how they relate to each other. I'm not just leaving it up to the reader to do the analysis. If you expect the reader to do the work, their name should be on the paper. Does that make sense? Not yours? Because you're not doing the job that the paper is about. You're doing the thinking so that they can read your work and benefit from what you have to add to what the world knows on this topic. And what are you doing? You're looking at a bunch of sources and you're saying, all right, when you look at these together, it says something new. How do you know this? Because you did the thinking. Okay? So this might be an example. All right. Let's say source. See, again, our sample topic is, let's say, online learning. LMS, which is a learning management system. Also Pro LMS. And they're all, let's say this on Learning Management System 1, Learning Management System 2, and Learning Management System 3. Okay. All right. So this is a hypothetical. Let's say your next three sources, they each talk about a different learning management system. Let's throw some names on these. Let's say Google Classroom. Let's say Canvas. And let's say, Blackboard. Right? They're different learning management systems by different companies. Okay. So if I'm going to talk about these as a whole, I can also then have another paragraph Okay. All right. So let's say I've got a source C that talks about Google Classroom, source D that talks about Canvas, and source E that talks about Blackboard. I may have another paragraph that follows those three paragraphs or whatever that then talks about how each of these learning management systems are similar and how they're different. That would be another way to create synthesis and bring the sources together. Now, again, this is analysis, not argumentation. Argumentation is where you're trying to make a point and be persuasive. Analysis, you're making a case and you're explaining it, but you're just putting the information out into the world. Your stakes are not that they agree with you, because that's not your purpose. Your purpose is to present information in this context. It's not to convince anyone, right? And again, I've talked about this in several videos. In research, that's our job. Our job is not to convince people. That's an essay. That's a different kind of writing. That's persuasive. Research is not persuasive. Research presents information with an explanation, and then it's up to the reader to decide, right? Persuasive writing is a different kind of thing. Okay, so this probably just looks like, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start messing around with my kind of hypothetical list of different paragraphs and sources here. Another thing we can do is these don't have to be separate paragraphs. Let's say I have one paragraph that talks about multiple sources. So let's say I have a I have a sentence that talks about source A. Then I follow that with a sentence that talks about source B. Then I have another sentence that talks about how those relate together. And then I'm done with a paragraph because I have enough information. Let's say that's a hypothetical paragraph. That totally works, right? And then maybe I have another paragraph that I've got 3 sources and 3 separate sentences, followed with a paragraph that synthesizes and explains everything together. Okay? Now don't pay too close attention to the specific words, but because they're just filler, kind of made up things. But that's another example for what synthesis might look like. Synthesis is a combination of information. It's not separating information. Okay? And that's one thing I want to make clear. You are looking at how things relate, how they are similar, how they are dissimilar, and what that tells us. Let's look at our hypothetical paragraph 1 here. Okay, let's say we present information from one source that is for technology. We present an opposing viewpoint, and then we talk about how these represent 2 different camps, maybe in the field of online learning, for example. What that does is it sets up that this is the new knowledge. The sentence that follows the summary of each of those sources, that is the new knowledge. There's also benefit to the reader because you've done the work to go find the sources and kind of summarize and analyze them. They don't have to do that work too. So that's the other benefit of taking information like this and putting it out into the world so that people can read your paper and they get a lot of information really fast because that's what you're doing. Okay? All right. So in a document that is just a literature review, this is what you're trying to do. For my students, their big paper requires 10 sources, and I've asked them to include at least 5 sources in their literature review because I know some of the sources it might make sense for them to just show up elsewhere in the paper, and that's fine. Because I understand the literature review is a part of the paper, it's not the entire paper. Some of you, your teachers may ask you to go write a paper, and the whole thing is essentially just a literary analysis. If that's the case, you break it up the way that makes sense for you by topic or whatever, right? Okay, let's talk about a couple different ways you might present information in a literature review. These are just logical strategies for how to present information. Okay? You can do it by topic. You can do it chronologically, in time order. Topically, chronologically, categorically. If you're trying to build up a case, then there may be some sort of progressive order that also makes sense, where you, some sort of a problem and solution order, right? You introduced sources that talk about the problem, then you might follow up with sources that talk about a solution to the problem. That's one order. You can do cause and effect, which is a similar idea, but your purpose is a little different. One is to say, because of these, causes, these are the effects. So you might have sources that talk about the cause, and you might have sources that talk about the effect. Does that make sense? There are a lot of different ways to present information logically. And you want to make sure that the order makes sense to the reader. If you're bouncing around because you're not sure what you want to do, stop what you're doing, think it through, make an outline, then order it that way. Because again, if you're writing anything, if your goal is not to be understood, you've got some confusing motivations, right? When we write, when we speak, when we communicate, we want to be understood. So it's worth our time to think, okay, how can I present this in a way that makes sense to my reader, that is effective, that makes sure I am understood, right? Those are all motives that lead towards being effective, but they start with having your reader in mind and thinking, how can I communicate effectively with them? Okay, so these are some strategies. You could do all of them, right? It'd be fine. But let's just take problem and solution as an example. Okay, let's say the problem is because of COVID-19, schools across America had to close, and teachers without experience teaching online suddenly were forced to teach online. Okay, let's say that that's a problem, right? And then maybe you present source A on the problem, source B on the problem. Okay, and then let's say we're going to present solution now, right? So let's say we've got problem, and then we're going to present solution. Teachers can use learning management systems to organize learning activities to help students to learn remotely. I'm just making this up as I talk about this. Okay, and then now let's say we have source C on the solution, source D on the solution, and source C on the solution. This might be an order or a strategy you might use. Is this making sense? Now, let's say this is a literature review and you're only doing 5 sources. Okay, this right here, this might be, 1 or more paragraphs. And let's say we're 100 to 150 words. And we just go in depth on this. All right, let's say we do that again for source B, and then there's a discussion on what these sources mean / what they tell us about the problem. Okay, so let's say that's something we can get out of this section. This section right here could be 200 to 300 words, hypothetically. All right, now let's say we go on to the solution section of the paper, where under source C, we present one source that could be related to the solution, source D, which could be related to the solution, and source E, which can be related to the solution. Sorry about the typo. Okay, so then I do a follow-up to explain, because it's effective to not just give information and expect the reader to understand it. We have to follow up with it to make sure we are communicating effectively. We don't leave it to the reader to figure out what we mean. We tell them exactly what we mean. That's just effective. Okay, so here in this section, this could be 450 words plus whatever this discussion is. So with this specific strategy, and you could easily have 600-700 words with 5 sources. Does that make sense? Because again, simple strategy, you're going to identify a problem, then you're going to identify a possible solution. So, because of COVID-19, schools across America had to close, and teachers without experience teaching online suddenly were forced to teach online, and maybe you give 2 sources that explain the problem. Okay? Then you explain what that means. This is not just in relationship to the sources. This is explaining what the sources mean. Then you go on, you transition to a new section. It doesn't necessarily need a new header, but maybe, sure. Then you can transition, say something like teachers can use learning management systems, or to organize learning activities to help students learn remotely. Then you go through your 3 more sources, for example. Source C, where you explain, 150 words on that topic. D, same thing. E, same thing. Then you explain what all those mean together. And then you'd probably have some sort of conclusion, which would summarize the problem and the solution. Does that make sense? This right here would be a solid structure for 5 sources on a given topic. Does that make sense? I hope so. I hope this is useful. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about how to use sources effectively. This is something I've also talked about in another video. It talks about how to use sources effectively, but I've got a strategy here which I think is useful to bring up right now, and I make it rhyme because I think that's useful. Okay, so you start with attribution, quotation, citation, explanation. Okay. Nope, that's not what I wanted. That's what I wanted. Okay, new page. So here's an order that you want to go through to progressively use sources effectively. Attribution. That is to introduce a source, author, content, etc. Right? It might look something like this. Larson explains ... It could be that simple. Maybe introduce the person for the first time. Dr. Jacob Larson, a high school English teacher, explains ... Okay, let me explain what's happening here. You are introducing your source, your author, your content, whatever the reader is about to hear, you're setting it up. Okay, so say it's the first time. Let's say it goes like this. You explain who the author is and maybe a little bit about them so that there's some context for the reader. Once you've introduced them the first time, when you go back to add more information, your attribution could just look like this, which just sets up the grammar. Quotation, by extension, is also paraphrase and summary as well. This is when you actually present someone else's words or ideas. There we go. I knew that was wrong. That's what I meant. Okay, so this could be what follows Larson explains. This could be a quote. E-learning is the future, or something like that. This could be what appears in quotation marks. This would be a quote. You can also have something that's not. I don't want that capitalized. Let's say one is a quote, one's a paraphrase, etc. This is the part that follows attribution. You've introduced a source and some information, then you give the information that comes from the source. It's their words, it's their ideas. Now, for clarity, when you use someone else's words, that's a quote. That has to be in quotation marks, beginning and end, got to do it. If you're using their ideas, but you're putting it into your words, it's a paraphrase. If you've taken a bunch of ideas and made them shorter, then we call it a summary. What follows that is a citation. Putting something in quotation marks is not a citation. Just to be clear on that. Okay, this is when you now, don't be confused between the difference between attribution and citation. Attribution, you're kind of setting up a foundation for the reader, which also might include information that's relevant to a citation, but this is not a citation. This doesn't necessarily replace it. This is just writing to introduce a source, right? I know you'll see people that'll just drop information without setting it up. When you're presenting a lot of information, that's good. But I want you to learn how to do this first, because this is the word craft of learning how to use a source instead of just dropping it into a text. The problem I find many students make when they just take information and they drop it into a text, start a sentence with a quote, and that's the whole sentence. It just looks like you're copying and pasting. You fail to explain, which is our next step. And it looks like you expect the reader to understand things, and you're just filling your paper with their words because it's easier. It doesn't look good. It's not an effective use of the source. So I would discourage you from doing that. Attribution helps alleviate that problem. Okay, you're going to give credit for where the information comes from. This is going to be what shows up in your parenthetical citation or your in-text citation. Okay, so this might be Lauritsen, 17, period. Okay, this is a point that many people get wrong. The period doesn't go before the parentheses. The period does not go before the parentheses. The only situation where period goes before the parentheses is in a block quote. In my students, I don't want them doing block quotes because that means your quote is probably too long, right? Block quote, when you have like 4 sentences, you can indent twice, you get rid of quotation marks, and your period can show up before the parenthetical citation. I don't like my students doing that because it means they're leaning on a really long quote instead of breaking it up to explain, which I would discourage anyone from doing unless it's absolutely necessary. And don't tell me it's absolutely necessary. It's going to be an exception. All right, so it's going to look something like this. It might look like just the number. This is where students get really confused. Teachers will explain, once you've introduced the author, you can just use the number. Okay, if you're doing a literature review and you're using lots of sources, it doesn't hurt to put the author's last name. In fact, it's never, ever, ever, ever wrong to do the whole thing. It's just not necessary. So don't mistake an exception to the rule, right? The rule is you give enough information, the author's last name, page number, paragraph number, whatever, to the exception, which is, you could just do the part of the page that it's on. That only works if you already know which source you're talking about, and that's clear, which, if you've done attribution, hopefully is very clear. If you are spending an entire paragraph talking about one single source, it's going to be clear to your reader. Every time you bring that up, you're talking about the same thing. It's going to work. It's going to be fine. But once you move on to the next source, then you need your attribution to make it clear who you're talking about, and you need to make sure you cite them. Now, when my students ask me, how often do we have to cite a source? This is what I explain. Now, you may disagree with me. That's fine. If your teacher says to do something, you follow what your teacher says. But this is my rule. Every single time you use someone else's words or ideas, when you introduce it, put a citation at the end of that. I don't care if you do it 3 sentences in a row. That just fills up your paper, and that's good for you. You look extra smart because you're citing more often. Here's the reason why. When you don't include a citation, it is implied that those are your words, not theirs. When you are presenting new information and you don't cite it, I don't care if you stick it at the end of the sentence. You're not being clear in your writing. You are implying that it's your word, and by default, by omission, you are plagiarizing because you are implying that those words are yours when they are not. Those ideas are yours when they are not. You don't want to plagiarize. It is just not worth it. Don't do it. Now, if your teacher tells you to do it, that's something that they can deal with. But it comes down to, it feels like a lot of work to do it. Well, guess what? Every time you do this, it's going to count as 2 words. Actually, let me double check. Yeah, it counts as 2 words in your word count. Lucky you. That's 2 more words you didn't have to write every single sentence. So it adds up and it helps you out. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Explanation. Once you have given attribution, you introduce new information, you cited it, in subsequent sentences, explain what you just said. This should be the majority of your paper. You introduce a source, then you spend most of your paper explaining what those sources have to do with your point. If the majority of your paper is citing them, you are missing out. Because remember, your job in writing research, even in a literature review, is not just to present their information. It's to add what you have analyzed, what you've learned, what you've said about it. That is the purpose of this paper, is to add your new knowledge to it. Does that make sense? If you're not doing this, you're doing it wrong. It's just their words at this point, and that's already been published, or else you wouldn't have been able to use it, right? So, explanation should be the majority of the paper. That being said, both I and probably your teachers would also suggest you want to cite frequently throughout the paper. Let me explain what that means. I'll write in my instructions, cite sources frequently throughout the paper. I'll have an entire paper of explanation with no citations. They get to the end, they throw a citation at the end, they think that they're done. No. You went a whole paper without bringing in anyone else to back you up, and you think that because you stuck them at the end that you're suddenly backed up? No. You fought a whole fight without backup, and someone else showed up to see you at the end. No. Use your sources throughout. Make the focus your explanation of the sources and the topic, but use them frequently to back you up. It keeps you centered on the research, on the source material, whatever that is. And when you've done that, you're going to look fantastic on paper. You're going to score well, you're going to do well, and you're going to be able to write an effective, not just a literature review, but any kind of writing that uses source material. Okay? All right. That's been a little over 30 minutes on literature reviews and how to use sources effectively. If you do what I've talked about in this video, you will be successful so long as, you have the other skills to remove mistakes and you have good ideas and stuff like that. But these are the skills for a literature review specifically. Now, the reason why I ask my students to do a literature review is it's because it's a section within a bigger paper, right? My students, if you're listening, don't write this thinking that it's one-off and it's by itself, it's its own assignment. It's not. Copy and paste this into your paper. It's supposed to be part of it. If you're not doing that, you are wasting your time by doing this. You're missing the point. This is setting up what you're going to do next. Because in a research paper, the literature review would create the context, then it would be followed with findings and analysis and discussion. This is set up for the analysis you're about to do. Structurally, it's the equivalent of this part of using the sources effectively. What comes next is going to be that explanation piece. Now, yes, you're going to do this throughout, right? But where you really dig into your explanation comes after the literature review section of the research paper. Okay, I hope that this was helpful, not and confusing. I could see how this could be, and I apologize if it was, but this is it. This takes practice. It takes a little bit of work. Remember, your literature review, your purpose is to take a bunch of sources, create synthesis by saying how they relate to each other, how they're similar, how they're different. Find a good logical order, maybe problem and solution, if that works for your given topic. And as you use the sources, make sure you are using them effectively. You introduce a source with attribution. You present that information effectively as a quote, a paraphrase, or a summary. You cite that source whenever you're presenting new information. If you're just referring back to something you've already said, it's not as necessary because that's already been established. and then you explain, you explain, you explain, you explain, you explain. If you fail to explain, you're failing the paper because you're not adding your analysis to it. Now, analysis is not the same as persuasion. Persuasion is, this is what I think, and you should think this too. That's not what we're doing in research. All right. I hope that this was helpful. If you have questions, feel free to ask me in the comments below. If you're one of my students, you know how to get a hold of me. I'm Dr. Jacob Larson. This has been Read, Write, and Cite. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.